You're welcome to the Policy Council. My name is Opeyemi Agbaje. Today we do the second in our Policy 101 series. The last time we did that, I spoke about why Nigerians are poor. Today we examine the consequences of Nigeria's vulnerabilities to the crude oil market on the Nigerian economy. So I titled this Crude Oil and Nigeria. I hope you learned from it. You're welcome back. It's still the Policy Council. Like I said, we're talking about crude oil and Nigeria. Why is Nigeria so vulnerable to whatever happens to crude oil prices? The answer is that we have vulnerabilities to the oil market in 5 different dimensions. One, crude oil is, of course, Nigeria's dominant export. Anywhere between 80 to 90%, sometimes more, of our export revenue comes from the sale of crude oil. And that is where, again, the same proportion of our foreign reserves, the earnings from exports that we keep in dollars in the central bank's offshore accounts, our foreign reserves, that is where 90% of it comes from. So without sale of oil, Nigeria will not have any foreign reserves, practically, or would have next to nothing in reserves. As a consequence of that first point, you have the second point. Our exchange rates, which is the rate at which we exchange foreign currency for domestic currency in Nigeria, is determined almost exclusively by our foreign reserves, which, as I've said before, is dependent on our sale of crude oil. So if we don't have reserves, our exchange rates will plummet. If we do sell oil, then we have capacity to defend whatever exchange rate the Nigerian Central Bank seeks to abide by. The third part is that virtually 90%, 80% or thereabout of our budgets, the money that the federal, the states, and the local governments share and put into their budgets, which they use to execute capital and recurrent projects, are essentially an outcome of oil sales. So if the Nigerian government sells crude oil, and if the price is good, the federal government and all the states will have decent budgets. The reverse, or the converse, is also true. If we do not have sufficient oil sales, we have budget constraints. Revenues plummet from oil, which, as we have seen, is 85% of export revenue, and therefore we have a difficulty in budgeting. There's a fourth consequence, or a fourth level of exposure to oil markets: inflation. And that is because the bulk of what we use, finished goods, consumables, raw materials for industries, school fees for overseas students, all of that produce inflationary consequences. So for instance, because of the link between oil and exchange rates, if the oil prices go down or oil volumes go down, the cost of importing goods and services and making payments in foreign exchange go up. And therefore, there's domestic inflation. So again, oil influences the rate of inflation in Nigeria. Finally, there's a final level at which we are vulnerable to oil prices: consumption. Because government budgets are tied to the sale of oil, and because many employees work for government, and many contractors work for government, and many businesses depend on sales to government or contracts with government, whatever happens to oil has an impact on consumption. So for instance, some civil servants are having difficulties with collecting their salaries because their state governments or whoever is responsible for their salaries has difficulties collecting those salaries because revenue has shrunk. Or it could even be a company that has done a contract with government and that has difficulty collecting its payment because revenue has shrunk. Its employees' consumptions will go down because they no longer have purchasing power. And so we have these 5 levels at which the Nigerian economy that we have created. It was not created by that automatically. We, the Nigerian government and people, have created that structure of economy that makes us vulnerable to whatever happens to oil on those 5 levels. Now, how did we create those vulnerabilities? That takes me to examine the long-term price of oil. In 1960, or indeed in 1970, we didn't have those vulnerabilities to oil markets. How did we develop them? It's useful for Nigerians to remember that oil has not always been a very expensive global commodity. I'm going to take us through the global price trend from 1960. But the point to note is that in 1960, the price of a barrel of oil was around $1.65. $1, less than $2. And the price of oil remained less than $2 over the next 10 years. Indeed, until 1973, when 2 things happened. Oil was not a significant cost. It was not a significant revenue earner for any nation, and it was not a significant cost for consumers in the West, where the bulk of global oil supplies are used. Its price was insignificant, less than $2 or $3 until 1973. Oil prices in 1960, when we became independent, was $1.65 per barrel. Guess what? Over the next 10 years, it fell. 125, 148, but at the end of 1970, oil prices were still less than $1.50 per barrel. Indeed, until 1972, oil prices were still insignificant. In 1973, 2 things happened: the Arab-Israeli wars and the formation of OPEC. It was those 2 factors that led to oil for the first time ever going above first going to around $4 per barrel, and then going above $10 per barrel. The formation of OPEC in particular meant that a cartel had been created of major oil producing nations, mostly Arab nations, mostly exporters of oil, not high consumers, because the major consumers were in the West, and Nigeria. This creation of this cartel, with the capacity to control oil prices, began to exert an upward pressure on oil prices. Nigeria and our oil-fueled prosperity was a consequence of the formation of OPEC and its market power. Now, from 1973, when oil prices went above $10, Nigeria enjoyed 7 years of prosperity, much like that story about Joseph and Pharaoh and the 7 years of plenty. But then, just like it happened with Pharaoh and Joseph, 7 years of plenty was followed by 7 years of famine, or in this case, something called an oil glut. There was an oversupply of oil on global markets. Oil prices peaked in 1980 at $40 per barrel. Nigeria's Brent, the Brent, which is the equivalent of Nigeria's Bonny Light, peaked at $42 per barrel in 1980. And for the next 6 years, oil prices began to fall. Nigeria learned the terminology oil glut and learned some other terminologies: austerity, import licensing, counter trade, all sorts of mechanisms, as Nigeria dealt with the consequences of having expanded its spending based on a commodity income, and that commodity price had collapsed. By 1986, that weakening of oil prices turned to a complete crash in oil prices. Oil prices dropped to below $10 per barrel. It is not curious, therefore, for you to recall that it was in 1986, having exhausted all tricks, import licensing, counter trade, all mechanisms to manage a basic fundamental economics mismatch between income and expenditure, we resorted to structural adjustment. and devaluation of the naira followed. Remember that until that time, Nigeria had a fixed exchange rate. We exchanged $1 for less than a naira, 66 kobo at times, rising gradually. But even as of devaluation, when we floated the exchange rate, the dollar was exchanged by our central bank for less than a dollar. The consequence of all these measures we took was to make somebody rich. Whether it was the civil servant who was given the duty of sharing import licenses, or the bureaucrats whose job it was to arrange counter trade, or the central banker whose job it was to ration scarce foreign exchange. Whatever mechanism we tried, it produced a distortion and made whoever was charged with the job of allocating a precious resource, the dollar, it made that person rich. So for the next decade, or indeed 2 decades, Nigeria was basically an insolvent nation. What did we do wrong? What were the lessons from the first oil boom and bust that Nigeria should have learned? One, in the years of plenty, we did not accumulate savings. Joseph, in ancient days, understood that lesson. But the managers of Nigeria's economy did not. And so in the years of the boom, we didn't accumulate savings. So when the years of scarcity came and the oil boom ended, we became cash strapped. The second lesson was that once the booms ended and the scarce period came, we did not curtail spending immediately. Instead of curtailing spending, we actually exhausted the little savings we had and we started to borrow. Our third lesson, or our third error, was that we had a fixed exchange rate. Exchange rates are the mechanism with which economic managers, or indeed economies, modulate demand and supply for foreign currency. If your exchange rate is fixed, in a period in which your dollar earnings are declining, within a very short time, you will be bankrupt. Because everybody will know that the dollar is cheaper than it should be. And everybody will get it. Indeed, in Nigeria, everybody took that dollar. Businessmen from Lebanon, from India, textile merchants, all sorts of people came to Nigeria because they understood that the dollar was cheap in Nigeria, including the teachers from Philippines and India and Ghana who taught us in primary and secondary school. They understood the economics. They found that the dollar was cheap in Nigeria, and they came to get it. The Lebanese businessmen did. The foreign expatriate businessmen did. And later, some Nigerian business people also did. But we sent them to prison for foreign exchange scamming. The final error we made was that we plunged into debt. Debts which we were unable to service. Debts which accumulated and became over $30 billion exposure to the Paris Club and to the London Club of Creditors. Until Nigeria got debt relief, Nigeria was bankrupt. You've seen how Nigeria wasted its first oil boom between 1973 and 1980. And you've seen the consequences. Our banks could not confirm letters of credit. Nigerians queued for essential commodities. Nigeria basically became a debtor nation with almost $40 billion of indebtedness to the global financial market, to Paris Club and so on. And Nigeria essentially could not develop. The quality of life of our people diminished, and poverty became a contemporary phenomenon in Nigeria. Fortunately, we had a second chance. A second oil boom that started around 1998-99 and that extended until 2008 when the global financial crisis happened. Fortunately also, we had people who understood the lessons of the first wasted boom in charge of both the presidency, a president who could enforce his will on the system, then President Obasanjo, and an economic team led by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala that understood the lessons of the first. So they did several things. One, they set up an oil price benchmark rule that meant that once the oil price exceeded a certain benchmark, they could save. So the first lesson of not accumulating lessons of savings was learned. So we accumulated savings and had $60 billion in reserves. The second thing was that they prevented external borrowings, except long-term development loans that were of low interest. And they negotiated a debt forgiveness with the Paris Club. And they did the right thing in permanently resolving the issue of Nigeria's indebtedness by using the accumulated savings they had accumulated to write off Nigeria's debt on very attractive terms. They curtailed spending even in the times of plenty, and so there was prudent budgetary reforms, issues around budget procurement and all of that, due process and all that at least ensured that we were not reckless in government spending. And they prevented states from going on external borrowing binges, unlike we did in 1979 to 83 when the state governments under Shagari went borrowing almost as if they were international players. The consequence of all of these sensible reforms was that in 2008, when the global financial crisis hit and the second oil price recession, oil prices dropped from almost $150 per barrel to below $40 per barrel. The consequences of that was that Nigeria basically escaped. Nigerians basically did not feel the impact of the global financial crisis. The only other thing, of course, that we experienced was that our exchange rate was used to modulate that correctly. And the exchange rate was devalued from 117 naira to the dollar to somewhere around $140 to the barrel. Again, like I said in the first lesson, exchange rate is the only way you can modulate demand and supply for scarce foreign exchange. And the central bank, under Soludo, did the right thing. So the second oil boom, Nigeria had learned the lessons of the first. Nigeria's people benefited from better economic management, and Nigeria did not suffer as severe a macro shock as we suffered under the first oil boom. Of course, that era had its own failings, and I will be the first to acknowledge its failings in terms of not leveraging the strong balance sheet and the strong income profile and the strong economic management that had been put in place in the social sector to deal with poverty, to deal with unemployment, to deal with electricity reforms, and to deal with rural infrastructure. But nevertheless, the macro conditions were better managed. Nigeria escaped what could have been a devastating oil shock if we had lived the way we lived during the first oil boom. If we had lived the way we lived during the first oil boom, the global financial crisis would have been a terrible period for the Nigerian economy. But we didn't, and we were saved that fate. Skip forward. What then happened when the global financial crisis came? We had, unfortunately, another team that didn't understand the lessons of the first. And the Yar'Adua regime basically went a spending, in my view, frivolously, and we began to deplete the reserves that had been built up. We also didn't pursue sensible policies that would bring further reform to the economy. Indeed, we reversed or attempted to reverse or at least delayed reform measures. We delayed power privatization, we delayed other privatizations, we moved away from the market model of power reforms in favor of a statist model that the state could not afford. And so essentially it was 2 or 3 years of economic drift. And it was only in 2000, the return of in the entry of President Jonathan as an acting president and the return to the power sector reforms that we began to remanage the Nigerian economy. Unfortunately also, we depleted excess crude. Government set up a sovereign wealth fund, which would have been a good vehicle for savings, but political factors did not allow it to work, and government engaged in a new era of spending. The consequence is that we have entered this current global oil shock in far worse conditions than we should have, with reserves around just $35 billion, with nothing, essentially $4 billion only in excess crude account, with the central bank having delayed adjusting the value of the currency for 3 years against all rational economic expectations, and therefore frittering away scarce foreign exchange in a period when we should have been accumulating reserves with oil prices below $100 and $110. So, we have entered the current oil crisis in a pretty weak condition, and that will have implications for the Nigerian economy. Now to the current. What's happening to oil prices? If you look at whatever graph, whatever table, whatever graphic you look at, it tells you only one story. Oil prices are falling. Nigeria's Bonny Light, which is equivalent to Brent, is also falling. Some analysts say that oil prices could decline as low as $45, $50 per barrel. Others are more optimistic. There's a divergence about whether it will be a short-lived decline or a longer-term one. But what is going on? What is driving this change? My view is that it is prudent to assume that this is driven by fundamentals. And therefore, there's no reason to hope that it will be a short-term phenomenon. Because new technologies, and we've heard about fracking, shale oil, are changing the dynamics of the industry. OPEC has lost market power. We saw that it was a major factor in accounting for the growth in oil prices. Today, OPEC accounts for about 30% of global oil supply. So it has lost market power. Oil discoveries are going on around the world. So I think that there are some fundamentals. Yes, we may be lucky the oil price shifts may be short-lived, but it is sensible to assume that it will not be, and to make the rational decisions that are required. Even global growth projections, weak growth, uncertain growth prospects, also mean that demand for oil will not be bullish. Domestically, I've spoken about the vulnerabilities we have to oil. Our currency, our reserves, inflation, revenues and budgets, and consumption. Additionally, financial markets are weak for various reasons. The capital market is falling, the banks are affected by some regulatory costs and policies, political perceptions of political risk are affecting economic outlook. So, apart from the economic fundamentals on the global and oil prices and all, there are domestic uncertainties that are also affecting economic outlook. So my point is that it is sensible to take the oil price situation as an opportunity for reform rather than as something we wish would be short-lived, so we can go back to life as usual. One consequence already is in the exchange rate. So we now have multiple exchange rates. An official DAS rate, somewhere around 168 or something. An interbank rate, over $180 naira to the dollar. And the black market rate that is even higher than all of that. Our history tells us that when we have multiple exchange rates, it's an opportunity for arbitrage and for fraud and for round tripping in the banking system. And in the end, it will be a severe economic error to allow that incongruity to continue. What could happen to oil, to revenues in 2015? We've seen scenarios. If oil prices stay at 60%, the simple consequence I mean, if oil prices stay around $60 per barrel, the simple consequence is that the revenue potential for the federal government and all the states will be down by 40%. How will our governments adjust to that consequence? Given the structure of the current expenditure, which takes the bulk of revenue, how will they pay salaries? How will they maintain all those commissions and departments and agencies that they've set up for every problem? How will the state governments, especially most of them, who pay even salaries from federal allocations, which means from the sales of oil, how will they pay their civil servants? Which projects will they carry out? How will they pay for projects they've already done? And this is in the context of a political transition, which means risks are also high from the political side. The consequence of all of this is that there is a serious need for policy change. We need to understand that we cannot live on a commodity price and hope that good days will persist forever. We need to diversify the Nigerian economy. We need to diversify our exports. We need to enhance tax collection. But to do that, we need to build a growing economy in which people are ready to pay tax. We need to deal with corruption because people don't pay taxes willingly or happily, at least, to corrupt governments. We need to empower small and medium enterprises and build a real productive economy. We need to stop subsidizing importation through low exchange rates and instead start encouraging production and exports. And we need to build a new knowledge about the reality of the Nigerian economy and the myths around oil and sustainable living need to be shattered. Nigerians have to understand that they cannot prosper because of oil prices. They need to understand that the only way this country will prosper is through producing things and exporting things and creating companies and businesses and industries that will provide sustainable export revenue for the country and prosperity for our people. I hope you gained some insights from that discussion. I hope it was not too technical, and I hope that it would impact policy and it would impact the ordinary person's understanding of the consequences of the type of economy that we build, one dependent on crude oil across the board for the variables of economic management. Thank you very much for watching, and compliments of the season.